So as people are still trickling in, please come up front, yeah. My name is Ajay Khanna. I'm one of the co-founders of PAFI, and we are delighted to have this session. I was mentioning to our speaker today, Mr. Saran, that it was almost 5 years ago we had this topic with him as the main speaker, and still people remember that session very fondly. So this is a subject which our corporates don't understand, neither we attempt to understand, but I think it's time now for corporates to look at. The topic today is coping with geopolitics uncertainty, how business must deal with the unfair challenges. And to speak to us on this topic today, we have Mr. Shyam Saran, former Foreign Secretary, former, the list goes on, but Special Envoy of the Prime Minister for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change, and currently, amongst many other things, he is the President of India International Center. Sir, thank you so much for joining us today. And with him will be in conversation Dr. TCA Raghavan, former High Commissioner to Pakistan and Singapore, and also he was the DG of Indian Council of World Affairs. So I'm looking forward to this session. As in all PAFI sessions, this is more of a conversation. The way we will do it is, I'll request Mr. Saran to give his opening remarks, after which we'll have a conversation between him and Dr. Raghavan, following which we'll have questions from the floor, so please feel free to ask questions. And then I'll request Vish to wind up, and then we'll continue the conversation over a cup of tea. Sir, over to you. You are the expert, and looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ajay. And may I express my thanks to PAFI for inviting me once again to what I hope will be a useful conversation with so many corporate leaders who are present here. And I would like to thank my colleague, Ambassador Raghavan, for being present here today and to help me, in fact, navigate this subject, and to Mr. Vishwanath for also being here on the dais with us. Obviously, I don't need to say that we are living through a very turbulent period in our recent history. Probably the most challenging since the end of the Second World War, although people may say end of the Cold War. But I think really the nature of the change, the scale of the change which is taking place is perhaps unprecedented since the end of the Second World War. Why is there such a turbulent period that we are living through? Well, one is, I think the most important change is really the change that technology has brought to our lives. Now, people may say today that we are witnessing a backlash against globalization, that there has been a stalling of globalization. But to me, globalization is here to stay. Globalization is here to stay because it is really the consequence of technological advancement. And as long as technological advancement continues to take place, I do not think that globalization will actually, either stall or reverse in any sort of enduring way. What is this nature of globalization? I think the nature of globalization is the world today is so densely interconnected, communication-wise, in terms of economic activities, just the sheer travel of people across borders. This world has never been as interconnected as it is today. This is a new experience for people in virtually every country that you can talk about. You have the internet, which has penetrated across the world. And no matter how many restrictions are put on trying to interrupt these communications, you cannot. That is, again, something which is here to stay. If we are looking at, today's social media is something that something happens today here, it is across the world in virtually instantly. Earlier, in terms of information or in terms of media, you had information mediated by media. That is why it was called media, because you have this mass of raw information, which then, the editors, the journalists, newspapers, magazines, television, they are literally mediating that information, mass of information, and then delivering it to you. That's no longer the case. Now you are being exposed to unmediated media, in a sense. So these are the sort of, seminal changes which have made the world a very different place from what it was before. Also, what has happened is that the unit of, in terms of politics, the critical unit remains the nation state. But, all that is happening around us has made the nation state almost, incapable of handling, the main issues of governance. The dividing line between what is domestic, what is external, is now very, very blurred. So you cannot, sort of isolate your country from what is happening around the world and focus attention on, okay, I will focus attention on my development. I don't need to really care about what's happening outside. You cannot do that anymore. So virtually every challenge that you face has an external component to it. Whether it is your stock markets, look at how the stock market gyrates from one day to the other. Not only in response to what is happening inside our country, but very frequently, mainly because of what is happening outside our country. If the US, Fed raises the interest rate or reduces the interest rate, it reverberates throughout the global economy. Or what, happens between Russia and Ukraine, that is something that, whether we like it or not, does impact on our developmental prospects, on our economic prospects. So this is the reason why the topic that I tried to choose was that today, business can no longer confine itself to what is happening inside the country. If it does not understand what is happening around the world, it cannot make the right business decisions. That is the simple point that I wanted to make. And in that context, if my proposition is correct, that globalization is here to stay. According to one commentator, he said, globalization is a bell that cannot be unrung. It has already rung. There is no way that you can reverse it. So if it is a bell that cannot be unrung, and globalization is here to stay, then I would say that the future will belong to those countries, those societies which remain ahead of the curve of globalization. Not those who try to resist it, not those who try to, somehow or the other ignore it. You would have to take that as a given. That is the one certainty in an age of uncertainty. That is one certainty which is something that we have to accept. So lastly, I would say that when we speak about globalization, I think what you are seeing today is precisely because of the nature and the scale of change that is being brought about by globalization. Just to illustrate something that perhaps we miss, that we had, as a result of the pandemic, a lot of interruptions on our physical contact. But look how the virtual world, in fact, you had galloping globalization as far as the digital world is concerned. To the extent that even when things are normalizing, we have not really gone back to just physical contact. So this shows how this has actually affected our lives. So if globalization is here to stay, what we witness is that because of the unfamiliarity of the change, because this is something which is unprecedented, it should come as no surprise to you that there are forces trying to resist, which is why you have the rise of populism. This is why you have the rise of narrow nationalism taking place. Because people are looking for familiar anchors. People are looking for, in this change which is taking place, what is something that I can hold on to? What is an identity that I can still consider to be something that I can relate to? And it is that kind of a sense of drift, of not being able to, really anchor yourself in something which is visible, something which is familiar, that you have this kind of backlash which is taking place. Now, so I end my, my opening remarks by saying again that resisting this, trying to somehow reverse this, trying to somehow make out that we have to somehow go back on globalization, that there should be a reassertion of national interest. I think this is really a kind of a trend which is not something that will give us the kind of future that we are looking for. So India, I think today is really located in a space and time where if it does accept this proposition and in fact stays ahead of the globalization curve, it is likely to have a much brighter future. And in that, the corporate sector, if they also realize this and in fact orient their business strategies towards that kind of future, again, you will probably succeed where others do not. I think that is the conclusion that I would come to.
Thank you, sir. I think this gives a perfect landing for you, Dr. Raghavan. But before that, this is not a Chatham House meeting. It's open. You're being recorded. It will be put out on YouTube. There is media presence. I just wanted to say that. I'll say 3 data points and then over to you. So just to supplement what you said, in a recent survey by McKinsey, the top CEOs have identified escalation of geopolitical risks as the 3rd most important trend after disrupting digital technologies and economic downturn. So it's right up there as the 3rd most important issue which the CEOs have identified. 2 other data points on the unfolding competition between US and China. 76 of the world's top 100 most valuable companies are in either US or in China. So you see how that impact is going to play. And the 3rd thing is this Russian invasion, so to say, has triggered more than 1,000 companies to pull out of Ukraine already. So I wanted to mention all that up front, and corporates have no clue, no idea how to deal with it. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ajay, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. For any serving or former Foreign Service officer, it's a great honor to be on the same panel as Mr. Shyam Saran. So thank you very much, Mr. Vishwanathan and Ajay, for inviting me. Now, I can't agree more with every one of the points which you made, but just to take up on the first point which Ajay mentioned, that in this churn of ceaseless technological change and the changes brought about by globalization, there are also certain fixed constants. And some things haven't changed. And one very clear and obvious marker which has not changed is the fact of strategic competition and interstate conflict, interstate contestation. And it's a reality with which not just corporates, governments, and common citizens live with every day. So one question which I always wanted to ask you, sir, and this is as good an opportunity as any, because it is something which has perplexed me and puzzled me for the last 14 or 15 years since I first went to Singapore, were these two parallel conversations taking place in India, which have ramifications globally. And the first set of conversations is obviously so evident, which is China as strategic threat and as strategic challenge, which is, I don't need to amplify that. But the second and parallel set of conversations, which is really takes place all the time but doesn't get the same visibility, is China as strategic opportunity. And that is really the conversation. If you go into any, when I was in the ICWA, we would have these discussions about all the threats which come from China, but if we walked across to FICCI next door, there was a different set of conversations taking place about China. Do you feel that these two parallel set of conversations, do we have a chance of harmonizing them? Is there an opportunity, or are we simply going to deal with it on a tactical basis from day to day? Or is there a longer term plan which will enable some kind of balance to be struck between China as challenge or threat and China as great opportunity?
So, if you see the history of India-China relations, at least over 4 decades, till we had the Galwan incident and everything that followed from that, essentially, both conversations were taking place in parallel. That is, there was a sense that the most important strategic challenge for India, not necessarily a threat, but a challenge for India, is China. Precisely because of the spectacular manner in which it had emerged. We too were emerging, but not in the same manner as China. So there was this sense that we need to keep our powder dry. We need to be firm in confronting China where our interests are being threatened in any way, but at the same time, there are things that we can do together. So, let me go back to 2005 when I was Foreign Secretary. The Chinese Prime Minister came to India, Wen Jiabao. In the conversations which took place between Wen Jiabao and our Prime Minister, they reached a certain consensus. What was the consensus? The consensus was, we do not regard India as a threat to China, and China does not regard India as a threat. So neither country are threats to each other. There is enough space in Asia as well as in the world for both India and China to rise together. Okay. The third, that India is too large a country to be contained by China or any other country, and similarly China is too large a country to be contained by India or by any other country. Again, that India is regarded as a huge economic opportunity for China, and we would think that India regards China as a great economic opportunity for itself. No? So this is a consensus, and why is this consensus necessary? Because India and China are the two largest emerging economies in the world. If we work together, not only would we be more successful in adjusting existing global regimes, such as the multilateral trading order, for example, but we would be able to do a better job in shaping some of the emerging regimes, like for example climate change, like for example cybersecurity, like for example managing global commons such as the space. So there was this sense that even though we compete with one another, there is actually a lot that we can do together. So it was, in a sense, it was a culmination of a long thread of the countries confronting each other on issues, but at the same time recognizing precisely what you said, that there is a great strategic opportunity. Now, it is very recent, therefore, that particular consensus and that approach is now being put in doubt. Not because of us, but because of China. Why has China changed its position? Because it feels that it is number one, no longer thinking of itself as just another large emerging economy. It is an emerged economy. That is how they feel. Secondly, after the global financial and economic crisis, there has been a huge change in Chinese perceptions with regard to its relationship with the United States and also the West. That this shows that a crisis which has taken place right at the heart of the world capitalist system shows that this particular system is now on its last legs. It is no longer Washington consensus, now this is the time for Beijing consensus. You know, we are benchmarking ourselves with the United States. We don't benchmark with other emerging economies. So that perception of what China's place in the world is and what it is entitled to as a great power and an emerged great power, in that kind of a frame, India has fallen, you know, fairly low in the priority of China. So this is a huge change from 2005. Because 2005, if you remember, even though China was growing at the rate of 6 to 7% per annum, India was growing much faster. It was growing at sometimes at the 9% per annum. So if you go back to that time, you would remember India was being projected as the next China, as the next big commercial and economic opportunity. The performance of India during tsunami, for example, where the Indian Navy, was out delivering assistance, even though we ourselves were affected by the tsunami. It suddenly the world came to realize that this is a country which has also huge, military security capabilities. It is that perception that this is going to be the next big power which enabled us to successfully negotiate the Indo-US nuclear deal. If Indo-US nuclear deal had to be negotiated today, we would not succeed. Let me tell you. So it was a very different kind of international perception. It was a very different kind of Chinese perception of it. Since then, things have changed. One, since the global economic and financial crisis, the gap between China and the US has shrunk, and it is still shrinking. The gap between India and China, which was actually shrinking, started expanding again. And that explains a lot of what is the challenge which we are facing today.
Thank you, but if I were to press you, that if we are going to be tilting more towards, not because of something which is entirely in our control, but because of the sheer pace of events and the pace of developments, if we are going to be tilting towards China as strategic threat or strategic challenge, part of the equation, where does that leave Indian corporates?
Yeah, so, every crisis should be an opportunity. So what does a study of economic history tell me? If you even go back to ancient times, you had, for example, the Greeks, who were the, in a sense, the center of knowledge and civilization at a certain period of time. Okay? They gave way to the Roman Empire. What did the Romans do? They learned a lot from the Greeks. That knowledge transfer enabled Rome to emerge as the next big, great empire. Okay? If you take the Arab centuries, where did they get all that energy from, that knowledge from? Very interestingly, a lot of the knowledge came from India, came from China. Look at the huge translations which were done by the Arabs of even Indian, Sanskrit texts. They were the ones who actually revived the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and the Romans. Because the universities which were set up in Spain, Moorish Spain, that is where the knowledge of the ancient Greek science and or the liberal arts, this was revived. The West got back its knowledge of Greece and its civilization from the Arabs.
Then what happened? Then, if you look at from the medieval period onwards, first you had the Spanish emerge, then you had the Portuguese, then you had the transfer to the Dutch, then you had to the British, and then finally to the US. Each one actually drew upon the knowledge and the kind of innovative spirit which was there from whom they were borrowing. So each time you see a established power being challenged in a sense by another power, but utilizing the knowledge of the power which is there. Hasn't this exactly happened now? You have China over the last 40 years, essentially like a giant sponge. It has absorbed knowledge, technology from wherever it could get it. Which is what exactly the US did, in the last century. So, how did China manage this? So here is a lesson to learn from China. What China was able to do was to utilize, to leverage a favorable geopolitical moment where, because the Soviet Union was seen as a huge threat by the United States, China became, as an ally, became a very major factor in completely changing the geopolitical equation. Now, that enabled China to actually utilize that strategic moment for really transforming China itself. Today, all the Western countries, United States, Western Europe, Japan, they have a stake in India's success. Why? Because India is the only potential countervailing power of any credibility as far as China is concerned, which is today where the Soviet Union was before, China is today. Now, if that is the leverage that you have, that today, not because of any love for you, not because you are a democracy, but because you are the only potential, countervailing power, if they have a stake in your success and continue to be today, despite their decline, continue to be still the centers of high technology, knowledge, capital, all that still resides in these centers. See what they have done to Ukraine, to Russia. So if that is the case, can you utilize this favorable geopolitical moment for really bringing about the transformation of India? Huge opportunities open up for the corporate sector if they recognize this, and this is a window which may not last very long. These things don't lie on the shelf. You have to pick up whenever it offers itself. So today is geopolitically a very, very favorable, potentially a very favorable moment for India.
So you wouldn't agree with the traditionalist or some traditionalist views or the conservative view that don't get involved with these external contestations, and you're better off maintaining a position of equidistance, which was the traditionalist approach, that if you get involved in great power contestations, you are likely to step out beyond your league and will get burnt. You don't think that advice is still worth bearing as a point of caution?
I'm going to add a little twist to that question. As business corporate people, we were told to understand politics but stay away from it. But now we have to understand geopolitics. So also, what's your advice for us as well?
The answer is actually related in a sense. Even if you try to keep away from geopolitical contestation, you will not be allowed to. Precisely because of what I mentioned right in the beginning. If you are so densely globalized and interconnected, how do you opt out of this? You cannot say, wait, I will get off the train, I will get back on it whenever I want. Sorry, that doesn't happen anymore. That is why I said this age is different from before. China could, in the 50s, completely isolate itself and develop, or try to develop. This is what we also tried to do, if you remember, in the early years. To Today, you cannot do that. Today, your development prospects for development is linked to what is happening externally and how you manage that externality. So to think that somehow or the other our interests are best served if we stay away from it, let them fight, we don't have any skin in the game. No, I think practically speaking it is not possible. Okay, now does this mean that I have to become an ally of the major powers in order to not just only in terms of dealing with the threat we are facing, but more importantly for me, the transformation of India itself. Because your ability to handle that threat is dependent upon whether or not you are successful in transforming yourself. Right? So if that transformation has to take place, then I think it is a matter of degree. It's not that I have to become a subordinate ally of the United States in order to be able to do this. No, you play the game so that you use whatever leverage you have to get the best deal for yourself that you can. If you were to completely go in one direction, you may not have the same leverage. So where does diplomacy count? Diplomacy counts in making certain that you are able to get as much leverage for yourself as you can. Maybe by becoming a subordinate ally, you may lose that leverage. So I would say that it does not mean that you have to put your interests with one side or the other side. No, it's not necessary. The advantage that you have is that unlike a small country, you are actually a very large country. You have a certain sense of yourself as an independent country, as a civilizational state. All those things count. They may seem to be intangible, but they make a difference. So I would say that you leverage your position as a country which is seen as critical to the outcome of that geopolitical contestation. The more you are seen as being critical in that contestation, the greater the leverage that you have. Okay? So you try to get the most out of it. Now, here is where how that game is played will create the opportunities that you may be looking for. But you have to understand that there is that larger picture in which you have to operate as businesses. So things which you could not get before, today you may be able to do it. See, if you take the example of the Indo-US nuclear deal, many people say, oh, it was a big failure because we didn't even get one single nuclear power plant. It was not about nuclear power plant. You were able to get, through the nuclear deal, you were able to get the dismantling of all the different technology denial regimes which were operating against Indian industry. You could not upgrade your industry because you didn't have access to that technology. Thanks to the nuclear deal, all those different technology denial regimes then were dismantled. And today you have much easier access to technology than you had before. You don't have a problem if an Indian company goes and acquires a high-tech firm, say, in the Silicon Valley or in the United Kingdom. There is no concern. If the Chinese try to do that, it will be a big concern. But for you, it is. If you want to have that kind of a business relationship, it's not a constraint. Now, don't underestimate the importance of that.
Well, I'll seek your indulgence and ask Mr. Saran one more
please.
question, which has I've often thought about, which is in the course of your service career, so and certainly in the course of mine, we have seen a change in the approach of Indian diplomacy. Not so much foreign policy, but diplomacy. The structuring of the Ministry of External Affairs, for instance, which was primarily an emphasis on bilateralism. To becoming more of a multilateral agent, and we are going to be the site of the next G20 summit and all that goes with it. But there is a certain new narrative around multilateralism which we are certainly in the midst of and trying very hard to construct. And to some extent it has received a certain resonance the world over, because there is a recognition that given the pace of globalization, you need multilateral approaches. Amidst this, you had a startling development virtually in our neighborhood, which was almost a kind of medieval diplomacy, which was Saudi Arabia and Iran making up. We, I think, paid excessive attention to the China factor and overlooked the basic agency of these two countries, that they need a better bilateral interface. And to an extent, the same thing happened between Japan and South Korea, but it was it's in a different context. But certainly Saudi Arabia and Iran is a very startling example of old-fashioned bilateralism, really triumphing over a number of other issues which were otherwise taken as given for the last 20 years. Do you think that has any lesson for us, sir? Do you think we are going, somehow not paying enough attention to bilateralism as an essential part of diplomacy?
Well, one, I would not like to make a very, sort of sharp dividing line between bilateralism and multilateralism. Best diplomacy is one which uses one to reinforce the other. And I think we saw that, again, my experience with the nuclear deal, that ultimately it was a multilateral outcome, because if we did not get the okay from a consensus decision from the NSG, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, we would not have got the nuclear deal. But what enabled that outcome at the NSG? I was going around the whole world, trying to lobby, each individual country member of the NSG to support India. I must have clocked thousands and thousands of miles just trying to, make certain that the members of the National Nuclear Suppliers Group supported India when it came to the final meeting. So what I'm trying to say is that, you have both bilateral as well as multilateral. In the best of circumstances, should actually support one another. And I think what we see happening with India today is that we are working on both. But big problem with India's diplomacy is simply the lack of resources. I mean, here you have this huge expanded engagement with the rest of the world, and what? You have 1,000 diplomats. I mean, how can you run a foreign policy with 1,000 diplomats? That is asking, I mean, I'm amazed how much we are able to do with such a small foreign service. I mean, I'm not being parochial, I'm just saying that it's amazing that when your external engagement has expanded so much, that you still have this small core which is actually doing it. So it is not so much, oh, are you stressing bilateral diplomacy more than multilateral diplomacy? We are not able to do an optimal job of either as much as we should be able to do, because we simply do not have, we have not deployed the kind of resources that is required. It took such a lot of effort to even get the government to accept that in 10 years' time we would go from 750 to 1,500. Right now we are about 1,000. There are many other things that you spend huge sums of money on. Why is it that this is not seen as a matter of priority? Coming back to what you see has happened with Iran and Saudi Arabia, I agree with you that there was perhaps an exaggeration of the role that China played. But in the world, perceptions matter, the optics matter. And so the fact that, the two NSAs were there in Beijing, and that, you had the Chinese state councillor, standing between them and shaking hands, it does tell a story. Now, you may say it is not really as much as it was made out to be, but it does make an impact. And it does reflect to me the fact that the kind of dominant position that the United States of America had in this region, that has diminished. There is no doubt about that. And if you see the trend, you had essentially the United States saying, we cannot be physically present here, but we will build up, coalitions which will not only safeguard our interests, but will safeguard the interests of our key ally in the region, which is Israel. And so this was succeeding in a sense, that, you know, the kind of divisiveness that you had between Israel and the Arabs, that had diminished. You have the Abraham Accords. Then you had the I2 and U2, which was essentially that, you know, you could also create coalitions of interests here, which would be both Arab as well as Israeli. And a country like India would be part and parcel of that. There was an expectation that Saudi Arabia would eventually become part of this as the key. UAE and the others would not have become part of this without a go-ahead from Saudi Arabia. Would not have been possible. So Saudis did bless this. But then you had this happen, which is essentially a reworking of the assumptions that the Saudis were making with regard to what is going to be the future. Now, both Saudi Arabia, Iran are absolutely the key actors in this region. And therefore, in one sense, it is good news that they are coming together. Because as you see, already it is having an impact, for example, in Syria. It is having an impact on Lebanon. So, to my mind, where we have perhaps missed out is not keeping up our relationship with Iran in as good repair as we should.
Thank you. I don't want to monopolize all the questions, so I'll throw it open to the floor. But
Thank you. Ambassador, would you want to kick off, Vish? You want to have a question, and then we'll take it from the floor. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. I think it's been an absolutely fantastic conversation between the two of you, but there's just one point, Mr. Saran, that I wanted to ask you. These are the new formations of the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum and the Quad and others, which are being, where India is now being drawn to with the idea that, you know, we'll balance out China. What are your thoughts on that?
See, I mean, the Indo-Pacific as a coalition which is not containing China, but in a sense trying to constrain China, you know. What it is trying to do is to say, or at least certainly India is saying, that we do not accept the unilateral assertion of power by a country which considers itself to be the most dominant in this region. It is inevitable. I mean, throughout history we have seen any country which is emerging as a major dominating power, inevitably it will trigger countervailing coalitions. That's inevitable. So what you see happening in the Indo-Pacific is nothing very different from what has happened, you know, in history before. But as far as India is concerned, the reason why I have some misgivings is that we have focused too much attention on the security aspect and not enough attention on the economic and commercial aspect. So you need to have, in terms of your influence and profile, you need to have both the security pillar, but you also need to have the economic pillar. In some cases, the economic pillar may even be more important than the security pillar. Okay. The first, I think, misstep on our part was walking out of RCEP. You know? And, you know, if we say, you know, this would have opened up the Indian market to Chinese goods, you know, flooded the market. Well, you see that even after Galwan, our trade with China has even gone up. You know? What it has also done is that whereas we were being seen as a very credible power in Southeast Asia, which could actually offer a certain countervailing presence to China, our walking out of RCEP has actually left us in a much weaker position politically as well, because we are not being seen as a important enough, significant enough actor. In that context, the IPF was like maybe a possible alternative. But then we started off by saying we don't want to be part of the trade pillar. So then the whole purpose of that exercise, which could have allowed us to get away from the margin back again towards the center, even that we have not been able to do, The good news is that there are reports that we are reconsidering whether or not we should become part of the trade pillar, and I hope we do, because I think that is very important. But for us to think that somehow or the other it is only by concentrating attention on the security side we will be able to actually influence events in the region, no, you cannot. And the Chinese have a huge, almost a lock over the region as far as supply chains are concerned. So if you want to make a difference, you should be able to leverage the size of your market. You should be able to leverage the fact that you are a country which is in terms of technological capabilities, in terms of even being a capital exporter is a very important part. And they were looking at you like that, but they said you have opted yourself out of the game. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a resident expert on geopolitics, Rahul. Give him a mic, please. Yeah.
Just one question, Mr. Saran. China, Russia, India. How do you see that panning out?
So this is an evolving kind of, I think, perception in India. One, I think we should make a difference in what was India-Soviet Union partnership and what is India-Russia partnership. They are not the same. Even though there may be some sentimental attachment to what the relationship was during that period, it is not that now. Whether we talk about it in terms of the economic relationship or in terms of even the security relationship. What has remained has been the residual defense relationship. Also because the Russians continue to be the country which is able to and willing to share technology with us, which even today the US or the West is not ready to. The nuclear submarines are it's like the AUKUS that this was already our AUKUS many years in the past. So let us not underestimate the importance of that relationship even today. But it has been a declining relationship. So if you look at the defense relationship, you will see that there has been a steady diversification of our military relationship, because when I was doing the nuclear deal and when we had the Indo-US Defense Framework Agreement, if somebody told me that maybe in a few years' time, the India-US defense hardware relationship will be as much as $20 billion, I would have laughed that this is simply not practical. Today, our entire transport fleet is American, the C-17s and the C-130s. So there has been a huge diversification of our defense relationship which has taken place, and therefore the Russian involvement in that has been diminishing over a period of time. And as I said, the economic relationship has also been very diluted. There used to be still a strong strategic convergence between the two sides, say for example during the earlier period of the Afghan war, where Russia also saw a Taliban government in Kabul as a threat to its own interests. And therefore India and Russia were able to work together during that particular period. Like for example in support of Ahmad Shah Massoud, etc. A lot of the assistance we were giving to Ahmad Shah Massoud was actually through Russia, because we didn't have direct access. That had started changing. One, in the defense relationship, it used to be that the Americans were selling arms to China, but not to us. That got completely reversed, because it was now the Russians who were selling arms to China, and they were selling the same arms to us. And in the early period, they used to give you a certain technological edge in terms of what they were giving you. Within about 10 years or so, even that disappeared. So, the strategic glue which held India and the Soviet Union together had started diminishing. However, despite the fact that a very strong relationship had begun to develop between
China and Russia. They managed to solve their border issue. They established a fairly strong, partnership in other areas. There was a sense in India, an assumption that we made, that longer term Chinese and Russian interests were not aligned. That main reason why Russia was getting closer to China was because of the inveterate hostility that they faced from the West, particularly the United States of America. So this was tactical. We also saw that if Russia is saying that Central Asia is its near neighborhood, that Eastern Europe is its near neighborhood, that is still the part of their security perimeter, because this is the old Soviet Union in a sense. Which country is making the maximum inroads into this area? Not the US, not Western Europe, it is China. So would Russia be actually happy about this expansion of Chinese interests? Not really. And even in the conversations that even I have had with Russians some time back, there was always this fear that that we are getting eroded in our own backyard in a sense. Also, a great concern about the development of nuclear deterrent by China. That while we have bilateral kind of deals with the United States, we don't have any control, we don't have any restraint on what the Chinese may be doing, and the Chinese would not accept that. No, we will not enter into any negotiation. So our assumption was that even though this relationship is becoming stronger, it is not one which is beyond a tactical level. And our conversations with the Americans and the Western Europeans used to be that you are, if you are saying that China is the main security challenge for you, how does it make sense for you to push the Russians more and more in that direction? You should actually be, in a sense, aligning with Russia to the extent possible to actually isolate Russia. But of course, that didn't have much traction with the Americans or the Western Europeans. So what we see is today, the likelihood that that tactical compulsion, that tactical alliance with China is now acquiring a strategic character. That the assumptions which we were making before, maybe those assumptions are becoming less and less valid. And that, of course, will be a very serious issue for us, because it is possible that even the residual relationship with Russia has with India, if Russia is really becoming very heavily dependent upon China, then China would say, why should you be supplying arms to a country which is hostile to us? That could happen. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I know that Sanjay, you wanted to ask a question. So shall we take some question and bunch them? So we'll take a couple of questions. Sanjay, you go first, and then Deepak, then this gentleman here. Yeah.
Mine is a very simple question. In today's newspaper, we read about China's interests in Honduras.
In
Honduras.
Yeah.
So what started 14 months back as a war between just two countries, Ukraine and Russia, it overlapped with other countries getting into the fray, Belarus, etc., Poland, and now it seems to have engulfed even the Latin American countries. So is it significant what has happened between China and Honduras?
Okay.
Deepak, can we get the mic? Thank you.
So my question is in terms of what are the opportunities for economic diplomacy in India's neighborhood, especially with China's sort of economy slowing down a little bit. Of course, it's still growing, but still down.
Get the mic here, please, this table.
One small comment and then a question. So many businessmen here, the old saying is businessmen will go where there is business. But we have seen national governments, not only India, outside, very limitations in really guiding and advising what businessmen should do. Donald Trump started tariff war against China. They banned so many Chinese companies, Huawei, 5G and TikTok. We banned more than 2,000 Chinese applications. But you see the trade figures, both India and US have been importing much more than they were earlier. All the advice from Prime Minister, President didn't help. So I feel that this opportunity and challenges we are talking about, I think today's globalized world, corporate sector will really decide. They need very little guidance from the government because you will go where you want to go. The second question, which I think Raghavan can also chip in, the kind of relations which India and Pakistan have been having, don't you think this has been the biggest hindrance in the emergence of SAARC in a major bustling economic forum? It could have, SAARC could have been the regionally integrated economy. It has not happened because of the kind of relations which we have in India and Pakistan. What can be done about it? Thank you.
Ambassador Bisaria, right there, please, behind you, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. My question is about global supply chains. Now, there are a lot of conversations around the single point supply chains coming from China, and we are seeing also a lot of global adjustments, and particularly in business. And for those of us who served in the North Americas, for instance, a lot of the boards are reconsidering their global supply chain. Some of them have already shifted them to India, like Mercedes and Foxconn and so on. So now the question before these boards is often, what do we do with our China strategy? Ajay referenced right in the beginning the 1,000 companies moving out of Russia. In a scenario, for instance, of China invading Taiwan, if similar sanctions to those that visited Russia visit China, what implications does it have for these global supply chains? Will we have similar sanctions? And I think a question from business point of view for these Western boards, as well as for Indians involved in business in China, is this a reversible situation, or will it get worse and worse for China as it enhances or increases its strategic competition with the United States? So are we expecting 20 years of competition with the danger of it worsening? And therefore, should businesses reconsider their supply chains?
Thank you. Sir, I'll just add one supplementary, is that decoupling of China and the US, how worried are you?
So let me start with the last question regarding global supply chains. I think it is obvious by now that despite the disruptions caused by the pandemic, despite the disruptions caused by the Ukraine war, the global supply chains have remained very sticky. It has not yet been possible to really shift away in any significant way from existing supply chains and put in place so-called more friendly supply chains or nearshoring or bringing reshoring. Those have not really yielded the kind of results that may have been expected. So if you take, for example, Southeast Asia, in fact, the supply chains linking Southeast Asian countries to China have actually become even more strong than they were before. So here you are talking about what we are today saying is the center of gravity of the global economy. So the reality on the ground is that not much change has actually taken place on the ground with the so-called shift in the supply chains. And that stands to reason because, certain infrastructure has been built on that basis, some logistic, sort of arrangements have been made on that basis. How do you change that overnight? You can't. And this is despite the intention being to do that, you find that you are not able to do that. I mean, look at the Indian experience itself. Your exports of pharmaceuticals from this country are competitive only because you have access to cheaper APIs from China.
80%.
Yeah? Much of your electronic industry, the components that you get from China, if tomorrow that is stopped,
your electronic exports will be also very badly affected. So the reality is that even though that may be the intent, there is certainly not much change which has yet taken place on the ground. If you see these regular surveys which are carried out by the Financial Times of what is the sentiment amongst members of the US-China Chamber of Commerce, large American companies who are invested in China, what is the sentiment in the China-EU Chamber of Commerce, which has very large number of European companies who are present in China. How many of them are actually thinking in terms of shifting away from China? For the last 1.5 years, survey after survey says that over 90 to 95% of the companies which have been surveyed say they have no intention of leaving China. Several of them, in fact, are talking about even expanding in China, because that is where the kind of scale of market that you are looking at, they do not have an alternative. So, it is not a surprise what you say, Surinder, that how is it that the volume of trade with the US has remained not only the same, but it has expanded, because that is the reality on the ground. Does it mean that no shifting is taking place? No, shifting is taking place, but it is taking place at a much slower rate than may have been anticipated. And the longer the confrontation lasts and perhaps becomes sharper, maybe this will speed up somewhat. But if we are looking at, there are companies leaving China in hordes, and India is the one country which will benefit from this, I am afraid that is not true. You should not put your make your prospects dependent on that. You should be an attractive investment destination because you are an attractive investment destination, not because you are dependent upon crumbs which are falling from the China table. No, that's not the way that we should look at it. So this great sort of focus on supply chains are changing and India should position itself to take advantage. I am afraid that is not something that we can depend upon really in the near term. Now, it is true that the decoupling that you are talking about, it is real, but it is real in the really sensitive high technology sectors. It has not gone down to other segments. So, if it comes to semiconductors, if it comes to anything which deals with artificial intelligence, applications, those particular areas which are very important in terms of future prospects, that yes, there is a decoupling taking place, and will probably continue to take place in the future, and perhaps will expand also in the future. But it is not extending down to other segments of the economic relationship. That is the reality. With respect to the
Honduras.
Yeah, I'll come to that. But just on the supply chains, I wanted to mention. Again, to illustrate the point why it is so difficult to bring about that shift. Take the Foxconn case. Apple making iPads, iPhones, iPods in India. Major investment. Government of India has made a huge amount of effort to really make this possible. The reality is that there are 14 Chinese suppliers of various components who have to be brought to India in order to supply this particular facility. Now, despite all the problems you have with the Chinese, the government of India still sees it in its interest to allow those 14 Chinese companies to come and set up joint ventures here so that those components can be supplied to the main Apple facility. Because you simply do not have suppliers today in India who can match that quality and who can match that scale which those Chinese companies have. So that is again reality. So we are making, you know, when you see the statements, but you drill down to what is actually happening on the ground, very different. Lot of compromises are being made. Why are those compromises being made? Precisely for what I mentioned right in the beginning. It is a globalized world. You know, how do you chop it up into pieces? It's becoming very difficult to do that. So even with regard to Indian business, I would say that that reality has to be understood. You know, you cannot get away from that. Now, the last question about Honduras. Well, China has been making an effort for a long period of time to deprive Taiwan of whatever remaining, 15 or 16 countries which still recognize Taiwan as the Republic of China. So, in that sense, this is not something new, something different. I mean, this effort has been there for a very long time. Is it linked to what is happening with respect to Ukraine war? Well, to the extent that the Chinese feel an enhanced threat from the United States and from the West and from this whole Indo-Pacific strategy to their claim on Taiwan. Yes, it is certainly a greater effort has been made to deprive Taiwan of this diplomatic network that they still have. But you know, the important thing to remember is, in terms of geopolitics, that no relationships are etched in stone. Okay, so today you are thinking that the Sino-US confrontation is here to stay. I would say for the foreseeable future, that is what seems to be likely. But we have seen enough changes, very dramatic changes in these relationships in the past, and I would not exclude it in the future. There could be a situation where China and the US decide that maybe this kind of confrontation is neither in the US interest nor in the Chinese interest. So why don't we at least temporarily, tactically come to some kind of a compromise? You know, Chinese suggest this all the time. They say, why don't we think of the world as three poles? You know, there is an Asian pole, there is a European pole, there is a North American pole. You know, let's agree that we can sort of somehow come to an understanding that each one is. Now, if that happens, that's not good for us, because the Asian part will be dominated by China, which we won't like to see. But while we try to take advantage of this particular geopolitical situation that I talked about, let us be mindful of the fact that those relationships can change. And we must therefore be, alert to signs that something like this may happen. Yeah.
So before I request,
about SARC
yeah, I'm going to request you to comment on SARC and
but I think
and both of you, yeah.
There was a question about the neighborhood. I have been saying for ages that India cannot think in terms of playing a credible regional role or a credible global role unless it gets its neighborhood right. So that's something that I continue to believe in, and I believe that the very size of India vis-a-vis its neighbors is actually in this sense an advantage. Because I have argued, if you just open out your market to everything that is produced by any of your neighbors and you allow them access to your market, it will still be a tiny fraction of your market. You are the main transit country for many of your neighbors. They have borders with you, but they don't have borders with each other. Today if a container has to go from, say, Dhaka to Islamabad, it takes about 3 to 4 weeks, and huge amount of cost in terms of the items being transferred from one particular ship to another ship and to railway and to roadways. Transshipment costs a huge amount of money. They could actually go from Dhaka through an existing railway network all the way to Islamabad in 3 days' time. Because you are the biggest transit country. Now, if you became the transit country of choice for your neighbors, you offered them the best deal that could be offered. Use any railway line you want to use any highway you want to use. Export, import through any port of India you want to do. What difference will it make to India? But look at the political impact of that. So, good neighborhood policy is something which is essential to me. What global aspirations India has, as I said, is very legitimate. But what are the instruments through which you are going to achieve that? And therefore, not to somehow jump over the your neighborhood and say, I will only link up with the dynamic Southeast Asia and others and forget about the neighborhood. Neighborhood will not let you forget it. So this is something which is very important, I think, in terms of how we relate to the rest of the world. How you relate to your neighborhood is a critical component of that. As far as SAARC is concerned,
well,
before you go there, just one more question to add, given your expertise in Pakistan. What's happening in Pakistan today? Do you think that will have an impact for India, especially from a business perspective?
No, it won't have any impact because we just don't have those kind of economic stakes in Pakistan. There's no real corporate presence in Pakistan, or there's no real economic interest in Pakistan. What is happening over there? There's chaos over there. Nobody quite knows what is happening and when it will end. But most people expect that for the next 4 or 5 months, this kind of lack of clarity will continue. Well, on SAARC, I first of all couldn't agree more with what Ambassador Saran said, that, I mean, no matter what you would like to believe, you cannot graduate out of your neighborhood. They just won't let you. And there will be a reality check sooner or later. On SAARC, in my view, India-Pakistan, the bad relations have had many negative consequences. SAARC is one of the smaller negative consequences because in the sense, because of the deterioration in the political relationship, there was not much to be done with Pakistan. And with the rest of your neighbors, you have supplemented what SAARC was doing bilaterally or through BIMSTEC. Although I will say that SAARC, more than what it was doing on the ground, because that was always constrained by how much each country was prepared to do in terms of developing infrastructure and resolving bilateral issues, SAARC had a certain narrative value. And I think the Chinese have seized on to that narrative value much more than we had expected. So while our predominance in the neighborhood, nobody can do much about, but in terms of narrative content, the absence of SAARC is something which we will pay a price for.
Thank you. I'm going to request Vish to wind up, and then we'll have discussion over a cup of tea. But before that, one last advice from both of you. What kind of structure you think business need to have to deal with geopolitics? I know that companies are now forming geopolitics advisory councils, but anything else you think we should be doing differently?
Well, I think, the wider geopolitics as far as India is concerned will always be a black swan event. You will never be prepared for what is going to happen. Something like Ukraine, something like what happened in Afghanistan, where overnight a regional architecture was changed, or the opportunities which are created by the Saudi-Iran patch up. There are opportunities for us, but whether we are in a position to take advantage of them quickly enough, I don't know. What can corporates do? Frankly, I haven't thought about it. Yes, geopolitical advisories, I think more interest in geopolitics and foreign policy amongst the existing institutions such as CII or the regional federations. I do think for a country of India's size, to expect that sitting in Delhi you will have a view of the world, I think is a limitation, especially for business. If you're in Chennai or if you're in Calcutta or if you're in Mumbai, you will have a different perspective, and certainly a regional perspective on international affairs is something which Indian business has to develop as much as the government of India has to develop.
Sir?
Well, I mean, one is understanding what the geopolitical situation is, what risks are there for business and what opportunities there may be for business. It is not only the government giving you that information and pointing to the opportunities. I think business should also tell the government what it sees as opportunities or what it also sees as risks. In many cases, you are there, dealing with whatever is happening in the country. That's a very valuable input for government from business. Second thing I would say is, are you investing enough in Indian intellectual sort of focus on geopolitics or in regional politics? Why is it that the top corporates of India are willing to give millions of dollars to Harvard, to Yale, and to Carnegie Endowment for doing work on geopolitics, and they are not prepared to pay a single penny to any Indian think tank to do really cutting edge work? Why? If you are so interested in geopolitics, why don't you develop that talent pool, that expertise within India itself? Corporates pay huge sums of money to consultancy firms like McKinsey or to Deloitte to do political risk assessment. They will do it from their perspective, not your perspective, not from an Indian perspective. You need an Indian perspective in terms of what the risks are, what the opportunities are. Again, I have seen in my own career serving in various places that, the corporates who are coming in are coming with reports from Deloitte or McKinsey. I can give a better assessment to them about what without asking for any single penny. So this is something that I would, if there is some advice you want, I would certainly say persuade the corporate sector in India, which is quite rich today, to why not invest in creating that kind of knowledge pool within India itself. You have some of the brightest people, let me tell you. I have worked with several bright youngsters, in Ashoka University, in CPR, which is unfortunately going down under. But these are youngsters who are, some of the best in the world. They need to be nurtured. They need to be given opportunities. But you are not ready to give it to them.
I think that's some food for thought for PAFI. But before I request Vish, I am reminded of the days of your ambassadorship in Myanmar and in Mauritius, how we worked together in building those economic diplomacy, and your guidance is still remembered very much. Vish?
Thanks, Ajay. I think, Mr. Saran, thank you very much for being with us for the second time and making it even better than what it was. I think every time we come here, we learn so much from you in terms of what we can do. And I loved what you said in the end, because that's something some of us in the room keep telling the corporates, that I think we need to invest far more in what Indian institutes and Indian experts can do in terms of an impact for business. Thank you very much. Dr. Raghavan, thank you. I think it's a pleasure to have two such great experts here and telling us what we should be doing in terms of looking at it from a business perspective. I think this reinforces the current thinking among many of us in the corporates that, Ajay said that politics and geopolitics is something we have stayed away from. But I think now we are more and more looking at politics and geopolitics, and we realize how it impacts our day-to-day business. And I think from a PAFI perspective, it's something which we want to invest in, we want to understand far more, and your guidance and support in that would be very useful, and we'd be grateful for that. Also at the same time, I think you made one very important point of how there is need to build greater bandwidth within the corporates and also within the government. If we want to deal with the large kind of challenges and the opportunities that are coming up from a geopolitical perspective in terms of what's happening. So thank you very much. But before I end, I would request Ajay to hand over a token of appreciation to both of you.
Thank you.
Carry on the conversation over a cup of tea. Thank you, sir. Really appreciate it. So this point about this thing, so very well taken.
Well, a lot of people have great hopes for Adani. There would be a rival